could we jump ahead to that February 10th, 1982 day at Daytona? I sent you those documents.
Thank you. Yes, I read those. Yes.
They also have your lunch order for that day up in the Flint Buick Research Center. I could see what the lunch buffet was. It was sandwiches, salads, everything. They have everything up there. But I wonder if you could just give us just the briefest narrative of that day. What happened on February 10th, 1982? Where was it and what happened that day?
Well, it was down in Daytona here, and I was actually out at the International Speedway Corporation's the large track that they own there, and we had a press conference, and we had set it up so that they knew, they agreed with what we're going to do, and so that Bill France, specifically Bill France Jr., he made sure that this was going to be done well, and that also from our end that we were going to be a first-class press conference. So it was done down there in the infield, and we had the old Goodyear tire in those days. That was still the highest place there. So we had the vehicles there, but the important thing was that we also took Ed Mertz was chief engineer at that time, so he and I were both down there to introduce this. But it had a bigger impact. I don't know how many dealers we had, but we had some key dealers. In fact, some of the dealers were actually car owners or owners of companies that race the cars, and so we had those. So we had some of the top dealers in the country, and so we had the car, and so we went through. I spoke a little bit explaining why we had the car, and an important part of it was so that the dealers understood here, and this was very important because this was not. We were not going to the old theory of you race on Sunday and sell on Monday. That was still true at that time. That's less true today, of course, because we have so many of our youth who are more interested in electronics than they are automobiles. But that was a very important. So it was important that these leadership dealers left there feeling good about the vehicle, and that it was going to impact more than Regal sales. Well, it ended up, as we talked here, the total number of Grand Nationals was not all that great, but the number of Regals, there was a kick in the volume, and I attribute that kick, a lot of that kick was because of the Grand National, because it had such a big following. And here a lot of people, race fans, couldn't believe that Buick was serious about getting into NASCAR racing. I mean, but we had, I've forgotten the number of teams we had, but we had more than one or two teams. It was probably 4 or 5 teams that were racing Buicks, and so there was it was a big rub off, and it was a very exciting day. Well, anytime you're down there, if you've been to a Daytona 500, and I've lost count, but to many over the years, it is an event. It's not just a race, and so there's 3 or 4 days ahead of time that people are down there for qualifying. And also, the accessibility of the drivers is very important. So it was a great day, and the reception was well received, and the key reception was by the dealers.
Yeah, and the world now had a Grand National.
There was, yes, there was, and NASCAR felt very good because that was starting to become more of a household, because it was not a household term in '72. So this was. I don't really know where the idea in our organization came for the name, who the person was. I don't really know how that came about. I would guess probably somewhere in design staff there. We have a lot of enthusiasts down there.
That was new information for me, that Grand National was a NASCAR term. I had no idea until I started this project.
Okay.
There was a direct link there.
That's right. It wasn't, one of those days it was coming out. That's why they were pleased.
I've seen pictures too at the Buick Research Center of that day, some press photos and some official photos. So it's clearly a nice moment, and it's a big. Well, it's interesting. I see the 82s Grand Nationals at car shows now, at Buick events, and of course all the Grand Nationals, other ones are black, and there's one, and the attention the 82 gets because it is so rare. It is really an anomaly at those shows, and people love them. They love seeing them.
Well, it's actually, I think it's a better looking car,
really?
GNX, yes, because what's happened now today, that you have so many stealth cars out in the street here now, so you can take and some of them I'm sure that we see would look like GNXs. that that they're really perhaps not, but they're
Right.
close.
I've seen people do that. A broader question, and you kind of touched on this. Apart from attracting new kinds of customers to Buick, was there in the Grand National an attempt to alter the spirit and soul of the brand? And if so, from what to what? What was that?
Yes, and one of this whole technological theme, because that was a demonstration that we put something. The turbocharging was a demonstration. But there have been some turbocharged cars before, but they were not the sophistication of that first turbocharger we had. One of the key elements was the fact that we did not have the distributor, and what that meant. Now that takes away a lot of problems and difficulty. We also had on that unit here, we were able to. It had a knock sensor in it, so that if the engine, you know what knock is, and pings, all right, it would adjust then. You hear the noise and sense the noise. That was detonation, pre-ignition is what it is going on, and then it would alter the timing. Nothing like that in production anywhere. And so it was in-house Delco Electronics that came up with those knock detectors. So what it meant then, that in our production vehicles, what we could do, we could build vehicles that, high-performance vehicles, that could run on lower octane fuel, because you didn't perform as well, obviously, but you got lower octane fuel. So the knock detector was another important part of demonstrating that technology part of Buick. Then we came along with the Riviera, the next year, and it was the first production automobile that had a cathode ray tube in it. And so we had each of these little demonstrations of something that reinforced this is a new Buick with a major emphasis on technology, and yet it's a beautiful vehicle. It isn't a techno gadget. So that was a very important part of that overall image. And then as the first turbocharger didn't have the sophistication in the development of the turbine, so that each year there's something new added on it, and so that it was, and then later on the intercooler. The early one didn't have intercoolers on it. So yeah, that was an important part of that demonstration, and it was also a demonstration because part of the theory was that, all right, we're not going to make these one-off cars. Well, we didn't for a while, and then we decided, we've got to have another bold step, and so we I recruited an engineer, Barisa, from the Delco Electronics labs out in California. Electronics, very bright young man, way ahead of his time in his thinking. And so we convinced him to actually come to Flint here, to Buick Engineering, to basically lead a project car that was called the Questar, QUES. And so to demonstrate all the capability Buick Engineering really had on electronics. And so that was a couple years later, but it was another one of those major steps, and there's in fact, there's a specific book written on that, and I happened to run into John here on New Year's Eve, actually, and so we were reminiscing. He's retired also, reminiscing about it. But see, that was another one of those electronic vehicles where electronics on there would find its way into the car. Well, the Riviera was the first one where we had that. Another one we had those, they're all over now, but those sort of luminous lights here, that it's a very soft glow. That the first Buick, or first product that had that, was the Park Avenue on the B pillar, and very soft glow. Another one we had on the glove box. Somebody said, you ought to have those glove boxes open like airliner doors, and so put an engineer on there, and they developed. Ed Mertz, it was his idea, and they designed on those Buick, top of the line Buicks on the Park Avenues. People, oh my goodness, this is really something. And then went to ashtrays and a lot of other places.
Now, in an earlier interview, someone told me that the Grand National was kind of like the tip of a spear that was going to split Buick. That on one side, into two complementary halves. On one side, you have the traditional, substantial, mature, distinctive Buicks, but on a parallel track, you'd have the performance versions of all those cars. Maybe the T-types, maybe some other name. But the Grand National was the thing, was the tip
Correct.
of that spear. Was that true?
Yeah, that's correct. It is. It was a one of the writers did a, and I'm trying to think of the guy's name because I happened to run into him at the auto show last year. Did a good article because it was really the T-type concept. Because once this Grand National got going, gee, we really ought to be using this concept on some of the other vehicles. And so first we talked about with Jaguar with the E-type, and so we call them E-types at first. But then design staff, they're the ones that really then came up with the theme for, we had a LeSabre T-type, we had a Skylark T-type, and we actually had a Riviera T-type. So yes, and it was a marketing, the challenge there now was and one of the problems was that you had to spend extra marketing money. And so, spend extra marketing money. And so, there were different receptions, though. A Sabre T-type, we probably sold more of those than any other one because it was a better looking T-type than the other ones. So it was a foray into that kind of philosophy. The volume on the T-types in total never developed enough to substantiate spending a lot of marketing money on it. So that's where a thing, and then there was a lot of proliferation in the plants. That was the other problem.
Bill Porter mentioned how Ford with Mustang had a similar thing going, that there was the more sedate version, maybe there was the hardtop, and then there was the fastback version. So you had two Mustangs, radically different spirits, but yet the same car. And he was saying how the Grand National was trying to do the same thing with Buick, that you'd have the traditional Buick, you'd have the performance Buick.
Yep.
And they're parallel tracks, almost like a mirror image of each other in many ways.
Especially on LeSabre. LeSabre and Riviera, that's the design studio he had, and a different guy had the Regal. And so I can remember the challenge was the actual execution of it, where the economics made sense. We just we're never able to get enough differential with the kind of tooling we were going to spend to justify. You couldn't raise the price a lot. There was some differential. But it was, there was totally different handling. And Gary Witzenberg, that's the guy. He wrote some. I don't know if you happen to know Gary or not. Okay, well, he has a lot of. He's a syndicated writer, but anyway, he wrote some great articles on the concept of what the T-types were.
We have 20 minutes left, so I just want to get through some of these. General question: as a car person, do cars have personalities?
Oh, absolutely, and that is very important. A lot of people think that we don't design products to have personalities, but one of the themes that we had as we were going through those years of the Buick making the changeover is that the same car may have a totally different personality, and that's really what the T-types were. It was the one that really probably sold the Plus business was the LeSabre, so that the personality of that LeSabre, base LeSabre versus the T-types was significantly different.
And in terms of the Grand National, what might the Grand National's personality be? What kind of car was that?
The original Grand National was really built for a young 40-year-old person, man or woman, sold more to men, but any man or woman, that basically served two purposes. One was that they could use it as basic transportation, but they'd also, you could feel comfortable driving up to an expensive country club with that vehicle. It's not just a family car, so it was a purpose. And the Regal itself, because the styling was so great on it, has probably more personalities, than most cars do here, because you get one paint job. Because we went to those paint jobs like that first one that we had. We actually tried those on LeSabres. Remember, we saw some of those, and they sold very well. And that was a totally different personality. It was a much younger, for a much younger person, and we also the same way with the handling on them. They were very different handling. So yes, very different. And that's the thing that we can do today in our industry that makes that a lot easier is that with electronics. So we can do things today, whether it's engines, transmissions, or suspension. You can do a lot without having to make major investments in facilities and tools.
Now, if you think of the maybe 86, 87 Grand Nationals, all black, intercooled, has that aggressive stance. If you can picture that, what message is that car projecting about itself, about who it is, about what it stands for?
Go back in time to that point in time. Now, because it stood that, listen, that Buick, this is first of all, they don't realize it's a Buick. So it was a statement that Buick has put a lot of emphasis on technology, and this car has got more technology in it than 95% of the other cars on the road, and that includes BMW and Mercedes. So it's a statement there that this is a high technology car, and the fact that we're able to do that with a base production car. And that's the trick. You can always make these one-of and stuff, but these weren't one-ofs. You could buy this from a production source. So that was a very different, bold statement. Now today, if you introduce something like that today, it is almost too understated now. And as I say, you've got this dark, angry look, is what I call it here, has permeated all parts of of the automobile industry. And so today, I think it would not be something that would fit in the Buick lineup at all.
Yeah, interesting. I think of the Grand National as an anomaly in so many ways. Considering that it's a 1980s Buick, and in the 80s, and I think in the public consciousness, the image of Buick was that doctor's car you talked
right.
about, a bit boring, a bit pedestrian.
Right.
So you have this car coming from that source, born of a Regal, an intermediate personal luxury car. You put those two things together, it doesn't lead you to expect it to do what it could do in terms of performance. Those two things together don't necessarily beget a car that can accelerate the way Grand National could. So I'm wondering, was this car an anomaly in 1980s Buick lineup? Was the Grand National different, and if so, how different was it?
Well, the Grand National and the GNX are as you know, they're radically different. So, was it an anomaly? It was sort of an anomaly, but it was a progression. It was a natural progression. Whereas today, if you put out the GNX, that would not be a natural progression. That is more of an anomaly because it is so fast and the stopping distance are so outstanding. So it is an anomaly. But when the first ones came out, they were not anomalies. They were cars that had a personality that, like I say, a young person, young being 40 or younger, felt good about driving, whether they drove it to the country club or whether they drove it with their family.
Or even drove it to the track.
Well,
like they could,
exactly.
They could stay with anybody, probably.
Right.
Let me see here. Yeah, just to point out, when I look at the black Grand National, when I reach that form, I think, the literal black sheep of the Buick family. I mean, it's because of there seems to be, maybe I'm reading into it too much, but I look at that car and I think, wow, there's a lot of frustration there. Like it's trying to crawl out of its skin and run. It wants to run, and maybe it feels a bit held back by its family name Buick, and maybe it feels a bit held back by this tall design, boxy design that in a personal luxury car is beautiful, but in a performance car might not be the ideal shape for a car that wants to run fast.
It is. Well, no, there's different points in time. There are bigger dichotomies. That's true today. It wasn't true back, in the 80s. It wasn't and I think that was because of NASCAR, because you had a lot of big cars, relatively large cars that were racing, and were running at speeds 200 miles an hour. But yeah, I think what your comment there is now in today's market, that would be more true here.
Okay. Once the car reached its full maturity in 1987, did it ever surprise you in any way? Did it accomplish something you never expected, or did it exceed expectations, or did it veer off into a direction you never anticipated? Did the car ever surprise you?
Yes, the GNX. Yes, that was a very large step, and the involvement then of the McLaren and some of those other parts. I would never thought that would be happening actually. So it was a big surprise, the fact that it had that kind of performance.
How about the Grand National itself? When you look back on it now, did it ever surprise you? Anything about the car?
Well, I think the thing that was the most surprising and a very pleasant surprise was the impact the relatively small volume of cars had on the impact of the high volume Regal and Buicks. I mean, there are a lot of people Buick people who are very proud of those. They never owned one. So it was really, truly a halo car. And when I tell people how many we sold, sometimes they look at me, 2,000, 4,000, 5,000. I said, yeah, those are all low volume cars. But, everybody knew about them.
Why do you think that is? Why does it continue to live, this car? Why does it continue to survive today?
Well, you end up, part of it was that it came at a time when Buick was flat on its back. And so it was a sign of sort of the good old American always betting on an underdog, And so that it came at a time where it surprised a lot of people, and probably most of all, it surprised the Buick dealers on what an impact it had. Because as we moved forward, then that was a first major resizing was done, on first the larger cars, the LeSabre, but then the most radical resizing was on those, what at that time we called the A cars, A bodies. And so it surprised them, and then we come along, and now we do something with that, and oh my goodness, look what's happened to the Regal sales.
Wow.
So it was a very pleasant surprise.
I spoke to a man in Chicago whose dad was a Buick dealer. They were one of the first to get the Grand Nationals, and as a 14-year-old in 1984, he worked at his dad's dealership, just sweeping up and helping out. And he said the minute the Grand National showed up in the showroom, they were getting people in that dealership they'd never seen before. 17-year-old kids with their parents saying, please buy me this car. Young guys coming in. He said, we never had that clientele in our store.
Right? Well,
that car changed everything for them.
Well, and the marketing, they did an excellent job on the marketing. This thing, they spent the money in the right place. I mean, and you see some of that happening now. I think with Chevrolet presently, with the last 6 months, well, last year here, some of the changes that have taken place with that Chevrolet marketing. I mean, it hits right at the heart, And so you say, well. It's an opportunity. It's what it ends up in a time when it's a very difficult time.
I also spoke with Darwin Clark.
Good.
A month and a half ago, and since he's from the marketing side,
yes,
I asked him. I said, was it difficult as a marketing person to integrate the Grand National message and spirit into the existing Buick language? And he had some thoughts on that, but I wonder what you think. Was that a hard thing to do? If you're over here in the Buick message camp, how do you get to that bad to the bone kind of junkyard dog thing that the Grand National was?
Well, but that wasn't a big step, because that first one was not that way, But the first one was not that way, and so it was not as difficult, I would submit, as it was to get the Hawk. That's the one that when I first went to Buick, I knew about 2 people at Buick. I mean, in those days, one division, you basically stayed always that one division, wouldn't move, and so all the Buick advertising had used that Hawk. That was quite an accomplishment for the ad agency and for Bob Berger. He's the one who put that in. But no, I see, because it was not, when we showed it down there at Daytona, the objective was, no, listen, this is not bad to the bone. That all came much later on. And no, it was demonstrating there, as I mentioned, the technical and the sophistication that we had there. And it wasn't meant to look like a vehicle that could run 200 miles an hour, even though they were.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, using any criteria you would like, in the end, was this a successful car?
Oh, yes, a very important part. If you look at the sales volume, in 1984, Buick set an all-time sales record. And you look at the volumes there, and the Regal was the one that really sparked that whole thrust. And then the Skylark that was another one that was a big surprise. But it sort of rolled along because the theme was a little bit. It was complementary. It was a little similar. The Regal, and there was enough difference in size that you could have sort of the boxiness there and the sharp, crisp lines. So yes, that the yes, and we. One of the things that happened is that the dealers really bought in to the marketing theme because they were putting a lot of money themselves in there, and it was a consistent theme. And a lot of them were every year you change the theme, you know. So what's happening at Chevrolet now, I think, is very good because there's a consistency now in whatever product they're advertising there, you know, and it does. As the ad says, Chevy runs deep. I mean, there's just no question about that. And so now we're getting back to some of those roots that we may have walked away from some in the past.
Yeah. Final question: did the Grand National achieve the goals you had in mind for it when the project began?
Yeah, well, they exceeded those. We had, I don't think any of us that worked on that project thought that it would impact the total Regal sales like it did, and in a way that didn't require a lot of special tooling. You know, we didn't. The body panels and stuff some of them were different now, but there was not a massive retooling.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I think it's a great success story here on the impact one product can have, and that was because there was a consistency, and that was the nice thing about we had separate divisions so that the themes there were cars that had a lot of the same platform, but very different personalities.
Yeah, absolutely. And for me, just in the end, as I look back at the Grand National, for me it's a bit sad that its life was so short, that it was introduced in 82, and then 84 to 87, that was it.
Right, very short spurt.
Because of the front-wheel drive transition. But for me, that's just a sad thing. And
well, but it's the kind of thing that may come back again. That's the other thing, you know, if you think about it. Because some of those names, you know, when they, like the Malibu, would you believe, you know, look at what came back, because a lot of that was the fact that it was a great name, you know, and people thought about that a very different way than the product. Now we got the new product here, so that, as we go along here, the Grand National, somebody may pull it out sometime and say, oh, let's put a little different spin on it. But it's, when you go through it, when you name vehicle, the new, I think the name Sonic here that Chevrolet is, you know, it just rings, you know, it's one of those, it sounds like Chevrolet. So, and Grand National now we've made it become something that sounds like Buick.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's it. That's
okay. All right. Well, thank you.